200 warriors circled his cabin, inside a wounded girl and a man who chose mercy. The wind whispered through the skeletal pines lining the ragged edge of Windvale, carrying with it the ghosts of gunpowder and broken oaths. Beneath a ribbon of pale moonlight, a lone cabin of weathered logs crouched among sagebrush and tumbleweed, half swallowed by the frontier itself. This was Elias Harlow's refuge, his penance, his prison, his last stand against a world that had branded him both sinner and saint. In the hush before dawn, Elias emerged, his broad shoulders hunched beneath a cavalry jacket, still proud enough to bear the stiff indentation of a silver medal tucked in its breast pocket. His eyes, the color of chipped flint, swept the barren scrubland. Frost gleamed on low-hanging branches, and every exhalation puffed out in a thin cloud of steam. He moved without sound, a veteran of battlefields long since faded into memory, each footstep placed with soldierly exactness. In his hand he carried a rifle, an old friend, its woodstock burnished smooth by a decade of use and remembrance. He paused at the edge of the porch, where the boards creaked low mournfully, then stepped off and knelt by a set of crude snares he'd arranged the night before. Two lay empty. One had trapped nothing but hollow expectation. Elias's jaw tightened. He never hunted for food alone anymore. His true hunt was for redemption, and that prey was scarcely visible, lurking in the twilight of his regrets. Behind him, the cabin door opened with a sigh. He did not flinch. He knew who would follow. There in the door's mouth stood a girl no older than 8, her pale hair tangled with dried grass, her small shoulders smeared with mud and streaks of dark blood. She wore the dress of her people's soft buckskin, etched with beadwork, and on her shoulder, half covered by torn fabric, was a crescent-shaped wound, still tender to the touch. In her hand, she clutched a talisman of carved bone in the shape of a raven. She did not speak English, but her eyes, those wide amber eyes, spoke volumes. They begged for safety, for mercy, for a promise he did not know he still had the right to make. He lowered his rifle, letting the sling fall to his side. His voice, when it came, was a rough whisper. "Come here." She stepped forward, uncertain, her small feet crushing brittle frost. He offered her a scrap of jerky, tough and salty, but she took it, nibbling at it, as if tasting hope for the first time. He watched, chest tight, as she shivered in the dawn chill. He unbuckled his own jacket and draped it around her, the pale silver of his medal pressing into his chest, like the weight of every man he had killed, every life he had saved or destroyed. In the cabin, he guided her to a battered table. He fetched a bowl of water from the corner well and dipped ragged cloth into it, then pressed it gently to her wound. She winced, but did not flee. Each exhale of her shallow breaths seemed to echo the thunder of rifles on distant battlefields. He dabbed and cleansed, binding the wound with strips torn from his own shirt. It was an intimate rite, this tending of another's pain, and with every knot he tied, he felt the tight coil of his heart loosen, if only for a moment. He offered her bread. She took it, staring at him with a caution born of betrayal. He sat opposite, unused to such closeness, and watched the rising fear in townsfolk's eyes drift away, replaced by something dangerously like trust. The dawn outside turned mauve, then gold. The quiet stretched taut as a drawn bowstring waiting. Beyond the cabin's rough walls lay Windvale, where the rusted spur saloon sat dark and shuttered, its patrons slumbering. But their thoughts were alive with whispers of Elias Harlow. They said he consorted with Indians, that he traded secrets for bullets, that he'd fled justice after killing his own kind. They did not know the truth that a single bullet had torn open a chasm between duty and compassion, and that he'd embraced exile in pursuit of absolution. And beyond Windvale's dusty street lay Shoshone lands, where war drums beat in memory and in hope, where White Bull, the tribe's venerable chief, paced among signal fires set high on Echo Ridge. When the crescent moon rose 2 nights ago, 3 fires roared in the gloom, 3 beacons calling the tribe to avenge their lost daughter. Those fires were a summons to arms, a promise of war. Tonight they poured sparks of red like blood across the sky. Elias sensed the shift as he slid open a trap door beneath the kitchen floor. A root cellar yawned below, stale with the cold breath of the earth. He lit a single lantern. Its tremulous glow revealed stacked barrels and spiderweb strand ropes. He lowered the girl inside first, then descended, closing the hatch behind him with deliberate care. In the darkness, he set a blanket on the dirt floor, laid out water, and stepped back to allow her to settle. She curled herself into the folds, clutching the bone-raven eyes closed in exhaustion. He retreated upward, securing the trap door, then crossed to the barred window. Through the frost-etched glass, he spied the first of the Shoshone War Party ghosts moving against the horizon. Bows slung tomahawks gleaming. Behind them, the ridgeline flickered with torchlight. Their war paint was stark in the firelight stripes of white ash and black charcoal across resolute faces. His reflection stared back at him. A gaunt man with a beard shot through with gray eyes rimmed by sleepless nights. A soldier by training, a scapegoat by fate, a guardian by choice. His hand drifted to the rifle's grip. In the hush, he heard his own heart drum the cadence of fear and something worthier resolve. Soft hoofbeats stirred the dust outside, jolting his gaze to where Shoshone scouts brushed past the cabin's shadow, moving like a tide of ill intent. He dropped to one knee, steadied the rifle, and waited for the moment when mercy would once again stand between him and oblivion. A figure broke away from the group, tall, slender, a young warrior, whose eyes flicked to the cabin window. He raised his voice, calling in guttural Shoshone. "Betrayer, we demand the girl." And from the war party came a chorus of fierce assent, a ripple of directionless fury. Elias exhaled low and measured. He traced patterns in the frosted glass before turning away. The girl below, he knew, would wake any moment, drawn by the tension in the floorboards. He had no plan, no allies here, only the rusted blade of his past and the fragile promise upon his shoulder. He strode into the room where he'd prepared his traps, pulling taut wires and empty cans. One wrong step would send a clang into the night, but at least it would buy time. He moved to the door, unlatched it, and stepped onto the porch. The war party halted at the tree line. The night air thrummed with the collective breath of imminent battle. "Stop." His voice rang out hoarse but unwavering. "She's hurt." A volley of arrows hissed past, whistling into the boards with an insulting clang. The young warrior stepped forward, drawing his bow back. Elias raised his hands in a peace he did not feel. "I'll bring her out myself," he called. "Do not harm the cabin." A hush fell heavy as a shroud. The warrior crouched, arrow pointed, assessing the betrayer. Around him the war party watched, waiting determination tangled with curiosity in their stony faces. Elias's heart hammered. He counted the seconds, 1, 2, 3, then pivoted and opened the trap door. Lantern light spilled like hope. He descended quickly, closing the hatch and placing his body against it. The girl stirred, pressing her cheek to the bone raven. "Shh," he whispered. "They want you back. You have to come out." Her eyes fluttered open. She saw his face lined with sorrow and iron. He offered her his free hand. She climbed up porcelain limbs, trembling, and stood beside him as he lifted the trap door. When he emerged, the warrior loosed his arrow. Elias twisted arms raised, and the arrow buried into the doorframe with a splintering thud. He charged down the steps, scooped the girl into his arms, and slammed the hatch over both of them. Splinters floated down as arrows rained on wood. They ran through the narrow corridor of the cabin, stepping over barrels, smashing a window at the back, with the reflection of torchlight behind them. Outside, he vaulted over a low stone wall into the scrub. He felt the girl's breath against his neck, warm and urgent, a living heartbeat he dared not betray. They sprinted toward a saddle lean-to where his horse stood tethered, its flanks heaving in the cold. Arrows thudded into the earth around them. Elias threw the girl onto the saddle, then mounted behind her, one arm around her chest, the other holding the reins. The horse bolted hooves thunder, pounding through loose gravel, carrying them away from the cabin's besieged walls and toward the shadowed hills beyond. Behind them, the war party emerged from the tree line, silent as wolves, and followed on swift mounts. The night air cracked with pursuit. Elias leaned low over the girl's head. "Hold on," he rasped. "I'll not let them take you again." She clutched the bone raven to her breast, eyes wide in the lantern glow of oncoming torches. In that moment, rider and child were bound by a single vow. Mercy would be their shield, courage their sword. Onward they raced into the dark, the wind roaring in Elias's ears, carrying with it a new truth, in a land torn by hate and old wounds. Compassion might just be the fiercest act of rebellion. And as dawn crept over the rim, painting the world in bruised purples and fiery golds, Elias Harlow rode into his fate, alone, unarmed, but undaunted. The betrayer turned guardian, with a frightened child at his back, and two worlds behind him ready for war. The night air shivered with malice when the horsemen thundered into Windvale's dusty main street, their hooves stirring up clouds of ember-tinted sand that danced in the torchlight. Elias Harlow crouched against the corrugated metal of his lean-to stable, pressed himself flat against the rough boards as Captain Jess Ironhand McCready's mercenary band swept past 6 scar-faced riders, armed tip-to-toe with repeating rifles and grim purpose. Word had come from Fort Blackridge that Chief White Bull's daughter had vanished, and McCready's orders were clear: bring her back dead or alive, or face the consequences of the army's displeasure. Elias watched the riders' horses snort steam into the cold air, their riders' shadows flickering against the boarded windows of shuttered shops. The mercenaries regarded Windvale as another frontier prize, ripe for plunder. But for Elias, it was the beginning of a reckoning he had tried his whole life to avoid. He slung his rifle across his back and slipped into the alley, where the saloon's back door sagged on rusted hinges. Inside, in whispered clusters by sputtering lanterns, the townsfolk exchanged fearful glances. Sheriff Trey Troy, once a friend in arms, stood at the bar, with his jaw set like cold iron, listening to McCready bark out names and charges. Harlow's been seen lurking on the ridge for days. One man spat his hand on a whiskey glass, so tight that the knuckles gleamed white. Trader muttered a woman, her thin voice trembling. "He's consorting with the Shoshone, feeding them our secrets." Elias paused in the shadows and felt the weight of every accusation press against him like barbed wire. He had become the town's scapegoat, the repository of every fear they nursed about the tribe and about the frontier's uncertain borders. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying echoes of distant drums, the Shoshone war drums, or so the settlers believed, a funeral dirge for their stolen daughter. Elias recalled the sight of 3 signal fires blazing atop Echo Ridge the previous night, the same signal that had summoned a war party centuries ago when boundaries were sealed in blood. He remembered the girl's frightened eyes under the crescent scar on her shoulder, the bone raven dangling by her throat, like a promise he'd never asked for. In the cellar beneath his battered cabin, she had drawn symbols in blood on the floorboards, strange spirals and lines that pulsed with ancestral power and hunger. Those marks were a language older than treaties, older than the rifles that had driven her from home. They were an invocation of ghosts, and through them, Elias felt the jungle of his conscience come alive. He slipped back into the night, the town's lamps receding behind him, and made his way toward the creek where he had hidden the girl's battered horse. Every shadow seemed to stretch into the shape of a rifle barrel. Every distant footstep sounded like a war party closing in. The stench of horses and sweat hung heavy in the darkness. An owl's mournful cry cut through the stillness, and Elias wondered if it was an omen or simply a creature going about its ancient business. He could no longer tell the difference between nature's cruelty and humanity's us. All he knew was that every choice he made from this moment on would echo like a shot in the canyon of his soul. When he reached the creek bank, he found her huddled behind a boulder, her small form trembling in the moonlight. She looked up at him, eyes wide and uncomprehending. Elias knelt, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead, but his hand trembled so violently he could scarcely hold her. He spoke her name, what he'd named her when he first found her. But she only stared mouth agape, as if she were a lost echo of innocence. Behind them, hoofbeats drifted closer. Elias listened and swallowed his fear. There was no time for second thoughts. Gently he lifted her into his arms, cradling her like a wounded fawn, then led her down the creek bed toward the hidden ford he'd discovered weeks before. The mercenaries could not know all his secret paths. They were hunters in a land Elias had learned to read like a weathered map. They traveled in silence, the girl's head resting on his shoulder while he navigated the slippery stones. Above them, the timberline trembled with a gathering wind that carried the scent of pine resin and distant pine tar, the smell of Shoshone territory. Elias's heart pounded against his ribs, every beat a reminder that mercy had made him an outlaw twice over. He had betrayed the army by sparing this child, and now he would betray his adopted home by abducting her from the mercenaries, if she could even still be called his. She was the tribe's blood, and by saving her, he had tangled his fate irrevocably with theirs. The memory of her clawing signs in the dirt at dawn, a prayer or a curse, flared in his mind. He had unleashed something he did not fully understand. They emerged onto a narrow trail, winding through a thicket of dwarf pines, the hoofprints of horses pressed into the soft earth like warnings. Elias paused and lifted a finger to his lips. Ahead, 2 mercenaries on horseback scanned the night rifles at the ready. He pressed the girl against the ground, crouching behind a fallen log. One of the riders murmured into a throat microphone proof that they carried the Army's communications gear before motioning to sound a rally. The other raised his rifle to the sky, scanning. Elias forced his breathing slow, tensing every muscle. When the riders spurred east, he seized the moment, bolting into the underbrush, dragging the girl behind him. The mercenaries' shouts faded into the night, replaced by the pounding of Elias's boots and the frantic whisper of the girl's ragged breath. Hours later, they reached a clearing where the forest opened onto a plateau overlooking the no man's land between Windvale and Shoshone Hills. The moon had dipped behind clouds, leaving them in shadow. Elias set her down and produced a canteen of water, pressing it to her lips. She drank eagerly, then leaned against his thigh, exhausted. In that quiet, Elias allowed himself a moment's respite, and the crushing weight of doubt returned tenfold. Sheriff Troy's gruff warnings echoed in his ears. They'll hang you by dawn if you don't bring her back." Iron Hand McCready's laughter underlined that promise. "Bring the child, Harlow, or your head's next." Now, as the girl catcher he never wanted to be, he considered surrendering her to the tribe rather than the army. But to hand her to White Bull's warriors was to seal his own death. Mercy offered no escape. It was a noose he could not untie. Behind the plateau, the signal fires flared again, 1, 2, 3, casting red globes of light against the low clouds. That ancient summons, unmistakable, drew a hushed awe from Elias's lungs. He should have felt the symmetry in the staging of weapons and the ritual call to vengeance, but instead he felt only dread. The girl stirred her head, lolling upward. She drew a shaky breath and reached into her robe, withdrawing a small bone whisker. Part of her mother's last gift he had once heard in tales, a charm intended to protect royal blood through any peril. Elias pried it gently from her hand and tucked it into his pocket, a silent vow that he would protect her with his life. Without a word, he led her down a jagged path toward the thicket of sandstone pillars he had christened the Sentinels. The pillars were lonely witnesses to every secret in this land, treaties signed in blood graves, unmarked in sorrow, and now the furtive steps of a white man and a stolen princess. As they slipped among the monoliths, Elias pressed his back to the stone and surveyed the valley below. Dark figures moved, men in furs and painted faces stalking in disciplined lines. The Shoshone war party crested the rise, eyes aflame with righteous fury. Their bows were strung tomahawks leveled, and every warrior wore a mark of white ash, signifying their vow they would reclaim her or die trying. Elias felt the pull of inevitability tighten around him. He set the girl down and knelt, placing a hand on her shoulder. She glanced up, confusion and fear warring in her gaze. He whispered to hear. "When I call, come." But as he drew his rifle, the ground trembled with the pounding of horses. Ahead, a lone Shoshone messenger galloped into the clearing, reining in with a shout that cut through the night. "Harlow, we know you are here. Bring the child forth, and no blood need stain this ground." A command from an enemy felt wrong. He was no soldier now, but a broker of life and death. Elias rose, the moonlight glinting on his metal as if mocking him. He called back, voice raw. "I will not yield her to bullets or tomahawks. She is under my protection." 30 paces between him and the first warrior yawned like a gulf of centuries. Between them, the girl watched with trembling arms, crossed over her chest, clutching the bone raven, now a half-sacred relic of her divided destiny. From the war party came a murmur that rose into a chant. Blood for blood, price for price. The echo grew until the canyon walls shivered in the sound, amplifying the threat. Elias's fingers clenched around the rifle knuckles white. He squared his shoulders and exhaled, feeling both terror and something fiercer defiance. He would stand here alone against 2 worlds that branded him a betrayer twice over. First the army, then the tribe. He would protect this child, whether they called him hero or villain. Mercy was his rebellion, and in that moment, he pledged it utterly. The wind shifted, stirring the girl's hair like a banner in the storm. In her eyes, Elias saw not just fear, but a spark of hope, a fragile flame that he would not let die. He raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack rolled across the valley, a solitary trumpet announcing his stand. In response, 2 arrows arced toward him, embedding themselves in the earth at his feet. The war party halted, uncertain whether to advance or wait for parley. A silence settled, broken only by the night's soft breathing. Then the Shoshone messenger dismounted and strode forward, hands raised. He spoke in fractured English, voice firm. "Why do you protect one who must belong to us? The blood debt cannot be paid in kindness." Elias lowered the rifle, but kept it ready. He met the messenger's gaze and answered, voice steady, despite his pounding heart, "'Cause I once killed to save her. I carry her life in my hands now. I will not betray that again." At those words, the war party wavered. The messenger's face flickered with conflict, his eyes tracing the crescent scar on the girl's shoulder. Shapes in the darkness behind him, 2 signal fires, mirrored by torchlight on the ridgeline, blinked in solemn affirmation. In those twin flames, Elias read the future a war could erupt. But perhaps there was a chance for mercy to bind the rift between his world and theirs. The girl stepped forward, clutching Elias's hand. With a voice small but unwavering, she spoke a single word in Shoshone that neither side understood at first. She raised her free hand and shattered the bone raven against a sandstone pillar, the snap of bone echoing through the night. Faces in the war party went slack, tongues faltered. In that act of defiance, rejecting the ritual talisman that once bound her to tribal law, she claimed a new allegiance not to birthright, not to blood debt, but to the man who had saved her life. Silence fell like a benediction. The messenger lowered his head, turning to his warriors with a gesture of uncertain peace. One by one, the signal fires on Echo Ridge dimmed, and the torches of the war party flickered lower. The mercenaries from Fort Blackridge, who had followed the flares to this brink of slaughter, sputtered to a halt in the fumigated distance, rifles lowered, but ready. In the hush between foes, Elias and the girl stood together, united by a choice that would reshape the fate of both their peoples. As the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, Elias lowered his rifle, his arms aching, but unbowed. Mercy had won this night. But at what cost? Around them, 2 armies faced one another across a valley of uneasy truce, their banners of hatred and tradition momentarily stilled. And in the quiet glow, Elias knew that his path lay beyond the frontier's end, between 2 worlds that would never fully accept him. He had forged a bond stronger than any law. The price of betrayal had been paid twice over, and in its place bloomed a new covenant that would demand sacrifices. Neither side could yet imagine. The night sky above the canyon crackled with cold flame as 200 Shoshone warriors poured down the rocky slopes like a living river of painted steel. Torches bobbed on spears and tomahawks, their flickering light casting 1,000 shifting shadows across the saguaro-studded ground. At their head rode Chief Red Raven, taller and broader than any man in the valley, his face streaked with black and white war paint eyes, gleaming with primal fury. Behind him came the thunder of hooves and the rasp of leather armor. This was no small raiding party, but the full force of the tribe's vengeance, come to demand the life he called the betrayer, or to spill blood until the land itself ran red. Elias Harlow stood alone on the ridge above the desert, clearing the chill wind, tugging at his worn cavalry coat. Below him, half hidden behind sagebrush, the girl crouched silent, clutching the tattered remains of the bone raven talisman she had broken. The girl's hair, once matted with fear and blood, now glowed auburn in the torchlight, and her small shoulders were squared in defiance that both warmed and broke Elias's heart. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Hand her over to die by tribal law, or stand his ground and die with her. He inhaled deeply the night air, tasting of cedar smoke and dust. Every muscle in his body was taut, every nerve alive with dread and the terrible clarity of purpose. He had been a soldier once, well versed in tactics of defense and retreat. But this was no battlefield, he knew. The rules here were written in blood and bone, and mercy was the rarest currency of all. Still, he would not budge. With trembling fingers, he touched the silver medal hidden deep in his breast pocket, the last relic of the man he used to be a prisoner of honor, who had lost everything for the sake of compassion. Below, the drums of the Shoshone beat out a pulse that shook the earth. Warriors chanted names long dead ancestors, summoned to witness the correct payment of the blood debt. Chief Red Raven raised a war club, carved with the feathers of eagles and wolves, and roared the tribal oath, his voice rolling through the canyon like thunder. "Bring forth the child. Return the betrayer for justice, or let the steel of our rage quench the land." Elias's voice cut across the chant, low but resolute. "I will not hand her over," he shouted. Gravel skittered down the slope as warriors raised rifles and bows in reaction. The girl's eyes met his reflecting torchlight, and hope the fragile flame of trust he dared not extinguish. "She is under my protection," Elias continued. "Never will she fall by your hands." A ripple of shock passed through the massed warriors, but Chief Red Raven's face hardened like obsidian. "Then you stand condemned," he thundered. He lifted his club high. "One man against 200. Your death is the only price we will accept." The warriors moved in unison, a wave of menace that undulated forward. But at that same moment, from the dark grounds beyond the ridge, emerged 6 figures astride horses. Captain Jess McCready and his mercenaries from Fort Blackridge. Their repeating rifles gleamed like cold stars. Their uniforms were patched and grimy, but their intent was clear. Capture the child, no matter who stood in the way. McCready raised his pistol, the report spitting fire into the night. 2 arrows thudded into the earth at his horse's hooves. The mercenaries faltered, but did not retreat. Now there were 3 forces converging upon this narrow battleground, the unstoppable might of 200 Shoshone warriors, the calculated steel of half a dozen mercenaries, and one lone man with a child at his back. The clearing at the bottom of the ridge lay littered with mesquite and broken stones. Under the copper moonlight, it looked like the jaws of a trap closing tight. Elias swallowed hard. He should have retreated into the canyons, used guerrilla tactics. But he could not run. He could not abandon her yet again. He raised one hand to still her trembling, then drew from his chest pocket a folded letter, its edges frayed with time. He opened it, voice trembling as he began to read aloud. "My dearest daughter, if you ever learn of this, know that I carried you in my heart before I ever held you in my arms. The fever took you the day you were born, and in my pride, I thought I could save you with medicine with effort until you slipped away. I buried your cradle under a blanket of lilies, and I buried my soul with you. But I have learned since that to let you die once more because of law or custom would be to betray your memory and the mercy I owe every child. If I must stand between tribes and governments, rituals, and revenge, so that your spirit, your light endures, then so be it. I am always your father in heart, if not in blood. Elias Harlow." He folded the letter, tucking it back into his coat. The wind carried his words across the field, into the ranks of warriors and mercenaries alike. A hush fell, as though the stars themselves had paused to listen. Chief Red Raven stared at Elias, war paint cracking like spent fire. The chief's eyes, cold with resolve, flicked toward the girl, and for the first time they saw not a vessel of tribal power, but a frightened child. In that moment, something shifted, 1,000 years of tradition wrestling with the flicker of compassion. Behind Red Raven, doubt crept through the ranks, softening the edges of spears and bows. Still, the chief's voice cut through the silence. "Words will not undo the debt. Blood calls for blood." He raised his war club again, but in the next heartbeat, the girl stepped forward. torchlight danced across her tear-streaked face as she held up the broken shard of her bone raven. With a sharp ringing snap, she crushed the fragment in her fist. Bone dust glittered in the air like fallen stars. "Enough," she cried in clear Shoshone, her small voice woven with steel. The warriors froze. The mercenaries blinked in astonishment. Elias's heart thundered as he realized what she'd done by smashing her talisman. She had renounced the ritual that bound her to tradition, declared herself free of the ancient blood debt, and chosen this man as her protector above all else. Chief Red Raven's war club lowered in slow disbelief. The thumping drums stuttered, and the rhythms of war slipped into silence. In that pregnant pause, the Shoshone looked to one another, their painted faces flickering between anger and wonder. The very earth seemed to wait, holding its breath. At last, Red Raven stepped down from his horse, crossing the space between chief and betrayer. His boots scuffed stone as he approached. Elias braced himself, hand on his rifle, but the chief merely stopped a pace away. He fixed Elias with a hard gaze, then, with deliberate care, laid a hand on the man's shoulder. "She is our sister now," he said, his voice low, but carrying through the stillness. "And you have paid the greatest price any warrior can pay. You have betrayed all that binds you for her." He nodded once sharply and turned to face his people. "Let there be no more killing this night." A collective exhale shuddered through the ranks as warriors lowered weapons and dismounted, laying spears in the dust like surrendered oaths. Down below, McCready and his mercenaries hesitated, then holstered their rifles. The captain spat into the dirt. "So it ends in words," he muttered more to himself than anyone else. He nudged his horse and rode away, his men following the echo of horse falls, fading into the canyon. In the aftermath, as the first hint of dawn tinged the eastern sky, Elias and Chief Red Raven remained alone at the clearing's center. The girl slipped between them, placing half a hand in each of theirs. Elias felt the chief's grip tighten around her shoulder, a silent promise of protection. Red Raven studied Elias for a long moment. Then he said, "You may not return to Windvale. The settlers will not forgive this. But neither will you be cast out from my people. You are between worlds. Elias Harlow, and in that place you may walk as you will." He nodded. "Go then. Find rest. We will meet again at the spring at the solstice and share water and song." Elias exhaled, relief and exhaustion mingling in his chest. He looked down at the girl who offered him a tired, triumphant smile. In her eyes, he saw not just survival, but the promise of a future. Neither he nor she could yet imagine one forged in the crucible of bloodshed, tempered by the grace of mercy. As the sun's first rays spilled gold across the canyon walls, painting the world anew, Elias mounted his horse. The girl settled before him in the saddle. Together they rode back toward the ridge where Windvale lay in fragile slumber. Behind them, 200 warriors melted into the dawn, their torches extinguished, their hearts changed forever. Above it all, the desert hawk wheeled in the early light, its cry sharp and clear, a herald of journeys begun and debts canceled in the name of compassion. And Elias, once a soldier haunted by his own rifle's echo, rode on into the rising day, a new purpose beating steadfast in his chest, to protect this child, to bridge the rift between men, and to walk the narrow path that few dared to tread. The pale light of dawn filtered through the smoke-hazed sky as Elias Harlow and the girl, now called Little Raven by those who had once called her chief's daughter, stood before the great council fire at the heart of the Shoshone winter camp. All around them, the assembled clans formed a wide semicircle. Stoic hunters in painted buckskins, scarred veterans of border skirmishes whose women, draped in wolf pelts, and the elders whose faces were maps of hardship and survival. The council poles, etched with generations' worth of totemic carvings, stood like silent witnesses to this historic convergence. Elias, weathered by countless battles, both internal and external, felt the weight of every pair of eyes upon him. Eyes that once saw only a mercenary, a white man, an interloper. Now they saw something more elusive, a man who had dared to cross the boundary of ancient rights in the name of compassion. Little Raven stood at Elias's side, her small form swaddled in furs the council had bestowed upon her. She clutched a bundle of sacred tobacco leaves, an offering to the ancestors, and her amber gaze flickered between her guardian and the council. She had grown in courage and stature since the night he'd broken the Bone Raven talisman. The scar on her shoulder, a pale testament to her own journey from princess to exile, from pawn to herald of a new era. Chief White Bull, sitting on a carved antler throne at the council's center, rose slowly. His eyes, once sharp with vengeance, held a tempered fire now. The lines on his face, etched by years of broken treaties and stolen children, softened as he addressed the gathering. Tonight he thundered in Shoshone, his voice rolling like distant thunder. We witness a union of mercy and tradition. We honor the child of our blood and the man who saved her against every law that binds us. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Some warriors exchanged uncertain glances. Old guard, still clinging to the ancient edicts that said any child rescued by an outsider must be returned at the price of that man's life. Others, younger and more curious, leaned forward, eager to see justice, tempered by grace. The crackle of the fire punctuated the hush that followed. Elias stepped forward, his worn cavalry coat incongruous among the furs, but carrying the quiet dignity of a man who had faced death too often to fear its specter now. He knelt on one knee, offering the tobacco leaves. Great spirits he intoned in Shoshone, his pronunciation rough but earnest. I bring this offering in humility and respect. I ask the ancestors to forgive my trespass against your customs, and to bless this child with life, laughter, and learning between our worlds. He rose, and a hush fell deeper still. Then Little Raven stepped forward, her small voice clear as a mountain stream carried across the silent powwow circle. I speak for myself. She held out her arms in a gesture both solemn and defiantly proud. I am no longer princess of White Bull's bloodline. I claim instead the name Little Raven, for I have broken the talisman that bound me, and in its place, I choose the hand that guided me to life. Let the spirits know that my destiny is not in ancient rites, but in forging a new path. A tremor of emotion rippled through the council. The elders bent their heads. Warriors wiped the corner of their eyes, and the air tasted of smoke and renewal. Chief White Bull raised his hand. Let it be so, he declared. Elias Harlow is no longer an outsider in our sight, and Little Raven belongs neither only to us nor only to the settlers. She belongs to the promise of tomorrow. With those words, the council fire blazed higher, as though the gods themselves lent their blessing. A song rose from the circle, an old war chant transformed into a lullaby of unity. Drums pounded softly, flutes trilled in response, and the assembled tribe swayed, releasing the tension of centuries. In that moment, the boundary between settler and Shoshone blurred, replaced by a fragile bridge of shared humanity. When the gathering dissolved, Elias and Little Raven walked together beneath the tall pines that marked the edge of the tribal lands. Frost still clung to the needles, and the morning air stung their lungs with clarity. She looked up at him, her face flushed with triumph and exhaustion. They accepted me, she whispered, words thick with wonder. even my father." Elias pressed a hand to her shoulder, feeling a warmth that had little to do with body heat. "They accepted you," he corrected gently. "And they accepted me by accepting you. It is our gift and our task to must honor this trust." He paused, searching the horizon, where the golden sun blushed over distant peaks. "I cannot return to Windvale," he continued, voice heavy with resignation and relief. "The settlers will see me as a renegade, worse, a traitor. I will live here at the border as you do now, neither one nor the other, but a guardian between." Little Raven nodded, understanding the price he paid. She folded her arms and blew on her hands, studying the morning mist like a new world. "Then let us build a home on the ridge," she said, determination lighting her eyes. "A place where both our peoples can come, can eat at the same table. A place of gathering, not division." So it was that Elias and Little Raven journeyed to a stretch of neutral ground, a rocky knoll crowned by an outcropping of sandstone boulders, halfway between Windvale's last cabin and the furthest Shoshone hunting lodge. There, with the tribe's blessing and the tacit approval of Sheriff Troy, who sent droves of settlers to help with tools and wood, Elias laid the foundations of a modest house. The walls were hewn logs, the roof thatch of native grasses bound with sinew and tar, and the doors carved with symbols from both cultures, a buffalo skull flanked by cavalry stars, peace pipes crossed with rifles. Within months, the house began to rise a beacon of possibility amid the stark borderland. He cleared the land with help from Shoshone hunters and Windvale farmers alike, teaching them to work side by side. Elders shared stories of the old days, how the pines once whispered treaties instead of gunfire, while settlers taught plowing techniques and the art of building sturdy hearths. Children came curious about the man who had defied two worlds for one child, and he taught them to read from battered textbooks salvaged from his cabin, and from bark scrolls illustrated with tribal lore. Little Raven, growing in grace and confidence, often guided her new friends through the pines, telling them of the stones where her people danced and where the deer gave their last great gift. In the evenings, they all gathered around the hearth, listening to elders recount tales of unity and loss of bloodshed and compassion, interwoven like the threads of a blanket. Every year on the anniversary of the Great Council, the house's wide doors opened to a feast. Chiefs and settlers, warriors and farmers, women in buckskin dresses, and men in denim coats, shared buffalo stew and cornbread, roasted venison, and corn on the cob. Laughter rang louder than gunshots once did, and goodwill passed from hand to hand like the pipe of fellowship. On that day, the border ceased to exist in men's hearts, and the ridge bloomed with wildflowers planted in a circle around the house, a living wreath to peace. Years unfurled like the pages of a well-read book. Little Raven blossomed into a young woman of keen wisdom and gentle strength, her hair shining bronze in the sun. She spoke both Shoshone and English without accent, her voice a bridge connecting two tongues and two histories. Men and women from distant towns and scattered lodges came seeking her counsel when disputes flared between rancher and hunter, settler and tribesman. Elias watched with pride as she mediated with the gift he once thought lost the gift of empathy. But life on the border was not free from sorrow. One harsh winter, a fever swept through the community. Not measles this time, but a strange, swift illness that even Billy the settler blacksmith could not cure with his forge's remedies. Little Raven tended the sick, teaching folk remedies she learned from the tribal midwives, herbal poultices of willow bark, and yarrow logic of steam and sweat lodges. Yet Elias watched helplessly as the fever claimed his throat, then his chest, then his heart. Night after night, he held Billy's hand in the cold glow of lantern light, whispering stories to ward off death's approach. And when the fever finally claimed Billy, burying him beneath the pines, Elias buried a piece of his own soul beside him. Grief settled on the ridge like fresh snow, but the community rallied. They built a cairn of stones around Billy's grave, stones placed by chiefs and settlers alike, each inscribed with a word of remembrance. Friend and brother. Thank you. Little Raven knelt before the cairn, tears gleaming in her eyes as she laid a single raven feather atop the stones, both tribute to the young man who had forged the first horseshoes for her house's foundation. Time pressed onward, as it always does. Elias aged the silver in his hair, multiplying the lines on his face, deepening like creases in well-thumbed pages. Yet his spirit remained as steady as the mountains that cradled their home. When Little Raven came of age, the council named her Peacebringer, and she began official emissary duties, traveling to distant reservations and frontier towns, carrying Elias's letter of introduction like a charter of unity. He watched her go with equal parts pride and longing, knowing that each journey risked her safety, but also knowing that her voice was needed where tensions still smoldered. On the 20th anniversary of her rescue, the day she was born, a new Little Raven returned to the ridge alone, finding Elias seated on the wooden bench he had built beneath the sentinel pines. He looked smaller now, bent by years and ailments, breathing with a rasp that spoke of labor and old wounds. She sat beside him in companionable silence, the wind whispering through the pines overhead. The cabin's smoke curled from the chimney in lazy spirals. Around them, the wildflowers they had planted swayed in a gentle breeze, their colors muted in the twilight. Elias turned to her, a warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "You're 20 today," he said, voice soft. "I always hoped you'd grow into your name." She took his hand. "You gave me that hope," she replied, "and much more." A hush settled. Then Elias breathed in deeply, as though drawing one final precious sip of the world. "Little Raven," he whispered, "my journey has led me here to this moment. I wanted you to know that every breath I've drawn was for you, for your life, your future. I have no regrets, child. You made my exile a gift." Tears glistened in her eyes as she pressed his hand to her cheek. "You gave me life twice," she said, voice trembling. "Once in that cellar and every day since." He nodded, eyes fluttering closed. The world tilted, and he sagged into her arms, like a man at last unburdened. His breathing slowed, and then stilled. By the time Little Raven raised her face to the violet sky, his spirit had slipped away among the pines and the ancestors he had long honored. She sat with him through the night dusk, bleeding into dawn, until the first council member arrived, a tall, gray-haired woman bearing sage and sweetgrass. Soon more came, and then the settlers, and then the children, all drawn by the dusk's hush. They fashioned a bier of bark and branches, carried him beneath the sentinel pines to a plot marked by a single sandstone pillar. Little Raven knelt before the pillar and inscribed with trembling hand the words she had prepared. "Here lies Elias Harlow, the man who saved me without knowing who I was and taught us all who we could be." As the sun rose, its rays struck the inscription, illuminating the words like a benediction. A breeze stirred the wildflowers, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath in tribute. Then, slowly, the gathered assembly placed stones around the pillar, a final wreath of love and remembrance. And so ended Elias's journey, a soldier who abandoned war to embrace mercy. a man who bridged two worlds with an act of compassion, and finally, a guardian who asked for no reward, but left behind a legacy of unity. On that ridge where the houses of settlers and the lodges of the Shoshone stood side by side, his memory endured in every feast, shared in every treaty signed in every child who learned both the powwow dance and the frontiers hymn. Through Little Raven, his spirit lived on, a testament to the truth that compassion can cross any boundary and that one man's mercy can echo across generations.